So when they said there was no more wine, when Mary told Jesus that, when they found out that there was no more wine at this wedding, it was a disaster. It was shameful. It was awful that it had run out of wine. The host was responsible for making sure there was enough there for everyone. And when they ran out, it would have been really shameful for the host. But this wasn't about that situation. This wasn't about weddings or wine, but it was a sign. This whole thing was a sign, and the clue is in when it says that about it being a sign in the passage. This was the first sign that Jesus had done. And there's some theological statements in here that we can easily miss, because they were made unwittingly at the time. The first is when Mary says in verse 3, she says, "They have no more wine." They have no more wine. This was an unwittingly theological statement about Judaism. There was no more of goodness in Judaism. And Jesus uses an old ceremonial water jars, the water jars that were used for cleansing, for purification. And he takes these water jars, or tells them to use these water jars, 6 100-litre water jars, and to fill them with water, because they were empty, fill them with water that would normally be used for this ceremonial washing. And when they come to serve it up, it's full of wine, which would have been the equivalent of about 800 bottles of wine, actually, in total. So he's replaced those for this new wine. And the stone jars would now be useless as purification vessels because they've been filled with wine. That was done, and this was the new thing that was now happening. Now, I'm not sure the master of the banquet would have realized that at the time, and that his jars wouldn't have been any good for that anymore. But at the time, he was delighted, because he says, "You've saved the best till now." And even that is a theological statement, you see. Again, he didn't know it at the time, but looking back, we can see it's a theological statement of that Jesus had saved the best thing he was going to do, that God was doing the best thing now, bringing this new wine. Basically, the water of failure and guilt and legalism from what had become purely religion, really, had turned into the new wine of forgiveness and joy and salvation that Jesus was bringing. That's what he was about to do. And as some of you pointed out, this was a sign. That's why it says this was the first of the signs that Jesus did. Because Jesus was, in doing this, revealing who he was. It says he revealed his glory, that he was the awaited Messiah. The one that Amos and Hosea had said was going to come. They'd said, when the Messiah comes, when he comes, he's going to bring, there'll be new wine. There'll be a new wine of blessing, a new wine of hope. There'll be new wine with him as well. They'd used those words in the Old Testament. So what an appropriate sign, what an appropriate way of doing it, a prophetic answer. And what an appropriate sign too, because the kingdom of God's often referred to as a wedding feast, isn't it? And here Jesus was doing this sign at a wedding feast. That's how it all comes together. Now, there's a second story that John tells straight after it. And we're going to listen to that story now. And Hilary Worth is going to read this one too, as it's John 2, verse 12 to 25.
Thank you. Yeah, John 2, 12 to 25.
I'm sorry, Hilary. It's not Hilary.
It's all right.
Hilary Rowlands. I'm sorry.
It's all right. I've had a name change before. I don't mind having another one.
I apologise.
It's okay. After this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother and brothers and his disciples. They stayed there for a few days. When it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple courts, he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and others sitting at tables exchanging money. So he made a whip out of cords and drove all from the temple courts, both sheep and cattle. He scattered the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. To those who sold doves, he said, "Get these out of here. Stop turning my father's house into a market." His disciples remembered that it is written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." The Jews then responded to him, "What sign can you show us to prove your authority to do all this?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days." They replied, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you are going to raise it in 3 days?" But the temple he had spoken of was his body. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples recalled what he had said. Then they believed the scripture, that the words that Jesus had spoken. Now, while he was in Jerusalem at the Passover festival, many people saw the signs he was performing and believed in his name. But Jesus would not entrust himself to them, for he knew all people. He did not need any testimony about mankind, for he knew what was in each person.
Thank you, Hilary. So, what's interesting is Matthew, Mark, and Luke all put this story that we just read much later on in their Gospels, at the last Passover supper before Jesus' death. It's when he takes his last supper with his disciples before he dies. That's where this story is put there. But John puts it right at the beginning of his Gospel here in chapter 2, this same story. Why does he do that? Well, one is because John is wanting to set the scene for the ongoing tension that's now going to happen between Jesus and the Jewish authorities, because it starts right about here. This tension where he's challenging the religiosity, really, of how things have lost its true heart, its true worship of God, its true being about God, and being genuine in its worship and prayer, and become much more about a religious institution. And Jesus is challenging the religious authorities and the religious practices of the day, saying that they've been starved of the true meaning. This is where it all starts. And from chapter 2 to chapter 11, John builds this scene where there's constant clashes with the authorities as Jesus speaks out about these things. And then from chapter 11 to chapter 21 of John is, well, that's where it is the Last Supper, the Passover there. And then the whole thing is the Passion, where Jesus is in the courts and he dies and he's resurrected and so on. All that happens in the second half of John's Gospel. But here John's setting the scene. So that's one reason. A second reason is because this story complements really well the water into wine story. So putting them together, John is kind of emphasizing this point. The old ways are now done. This is the start of the new messianic age, the new way that Christ is doing things. It is at the Passover feast. And so just to remind us, for those that may not remember or know, the Passover feast was a Jewish feast in the spring, an annual festival. And it remembered what God had done when he'd freed the people from Egypt. And what the people had done at the time was God had told them to sacrifice a lamb and put blood over the doorposts of their houses. And if they did that, then when the angel of death came over and killed the firstborn of all the Egyptian sons, because they were being stubborn and not letting the Israelites go out of slavery, then that was the extreme, the end of all the way that God had been trying to tell them to go. They wouldn't let them go, and this was the end of that. But to protect the Israelites, all who had faith in God, were to put this blood over the doorways, and they would be spared. They would be able to, their children wouldn't die, and so on. So this was what was to happen. And the Israelites had always remembered that. The Jewish people had always remembered that later on. And each year they sacrificed a lamb in memory of what had happened, and had a feast to celebrate what God had done in setting them free. Now, each year people would come up to their temple and they would bring their sacrifices to God as well and ask God to bless them. And so when they came to the temple, they would need a sacrifice to make there, to come and worship at the temple for the Passover. Now, sacrifices were sold in the temple as well, and a lot of that was for convenience, because people wouldn't necessarily all bring their own things with them, so they could buy something there for convenience. The problem was, this was in the Gentile courts. So the Gentile courts of the temple were where the Gentiles could come and pray and worship, and then the Jews were allowed to go through to the next bit and worship there. So what the Jews were doing was, and the temple authorities were doing, was using the Gentile bit, because Gentiles weren't very important. They were using their bit of the temple to do all this marketing and selling all these things. So the Gentiles couldn't truly worship in that place. The people outside of the Jewish nation couldn't really worship in that place. Well, remember that the Jews were meant to be blessing the Gentiles, but they weren't. They were treating them not nice, and they were even using their worship space, stopping them getting to God and worship God. So that was one thing that was happening. The second thing was that they were selling these things in the temple, but part of that was all about money. It was for extra cash that they were doing it in this area of the temple, because they would get the money profits from the sale of these things in the temple. So that was one thing. Secondly, there was the exchange rate, because they charge a percentage on people changing their currency, foreign currency and so on. So that's another reason. And part of that as well was you had to use a pure silver Tyrian shekel for your temple tax, and people didn't have that. The place you got it was at the temple, so they had to change the money to that as well in order to have the right temple tax. And of course, they were making us the percentage rates, like going to the airport when the prices are a bit higher at the airport than anywhere else. They were charging a good interest rate on that. So Mark 11 describes it as a den of robbers. That's what Jesus said. It was like a den of thieves, den of robbers. And he's angry about this. He's angry about the using all this Gentile space, the forcing, not giving them room to worship, that they're doing all this marketing there, they're selling these things. He picks up on the doves in particular in this passage, which I find interesting. They would have sold doves as well, no doubt, because there was poorer people who maybe couldn't afford the lambs and so on. And that may be a reason. But was it also a lesser sacrifice? Like, some people would come and it would be cheaper to do that, and they could offer just the very least they needed to as well. Weren't really willing to make really sacrificial. So don't know the reasons all to it. Jesus would know the particular reasons, but all of these things could have come into it. And Jesus was angry. He wasn't happy with what they were doing, but he also wanted to make a statement as well about what he had come to do. And some people think at this point that Jesus lost his temper, that it was just a burst of anger and temper, and justify it by saying, well, even Jesus lost his temper at times, and look what he did. He threw over the tables and everything, and it's therefore it's okay. Everyone understands it on occasions. But that isn't it here. Because it says that Jesus went away, and while he was angry with righteous anger because of people not, remember, this was about God and people not worshiping God properly. It was a righteous anger for God's glory and honor, not for his own, in the sense, not for a personal thing, but for what God should have, right worship. But also he went away and he made a whip. So this wasn't just a rash temper thing. He went away, he thought about what he was going to do, about the statements he was going to make, about the impact it would have, and he braids this whip together that he makes out of cords to go back into the temple courts and drive out the people there. And he says, how dare you turn my father's house into a market? This was a massive thing. It would have had a big impact because it was the life of the people. It was the center of law, the center of life. It was all happening here. And Jesus went in and challenged it all. It was a prophetic call to return to the center of worship and prayer, because they'd lost it. They'd lost what it was all about. And it says in verse 17, the disciples remembered this later. They referred to Psalm 69, verse 9, where it said in scripture, zeal for your house will consume me. It was only later on when they realized this. And actually, it was because of that. That was one of the reasons given for why they crucified Jesus later on. But this isn't just about how a church building should be used, like today. Some people talk about you shouldn't sell things in a church, and things like that because of this. It isn't about that necessarily, because Jesus was the new temple he was talking about here. We've got to remember that. It's about genuine worship that honors God, like he later told a Samaritan woman in just 2 chapters later in John chapter 4. Verse 18 to 21 tells us that the Jews demanded a sign to prove Jesus' authority to do this. What right have you got to walk into our temple and do this and overthrow the tables and challenge us? Who are you to do this? And Jesus answers with a little riddle. He says, destroy this temple and I will raise it again in 3 days. And the emphasis there is on this, destroy this temple. And that's what they miss, because so far it's taken 46 years to build this temple and it's still ongoing. They're still building it at the time, and destruction of it was unthinkable. Like, why would it happen? How could it happen? We're still building it. It's a magnificent building and it's God's building. So it would be unthinkable. And how could anyone rebuild it in 3 days? It just couldn't happen. That's crazy. This man's mad. Later, at his trial, Mark and Matthew note that this is part of the reason he was condemned as well, because of this claim. But he was talking about him. That's why he says, destroy this temple. He was talking about his body, the temple of his body. He would rebuild in 3 days. It's interesting to note the Jerusalem temple, when it was completed, about 6 years after it was completed, it was destroyed by the Romans. But it didn't matter in one sense, because it didn't need to be the heart of what worship was all about. Jesus was the heart of what worship was all about, and he did rise 3 days later. He was rebuilt, restored 3 days later, and that's what Jesus had been referring to. Verse 22, the disciples remembered all of this after he'd risen again. And it says, then they believed the scriptures and they believed Jesus when they thought back and remembered it all. Now, it's interesting, in verse 11 of the first story that we read, the wedding in Cana one, in verse 11, it said they believed in Jesus. The disciples at that point put their faith in him. They believed in him and put their faith in him in Cana. That's in verse 11. But here it says in verse 22, but here they believed in him. So which was it? Did they believe then or did they believe now? What happened was, in Cana, when he did the miracles, they believed in him. They put their faith in him. They thought, this man is special. There's something special. He is a man of God in some way. But it was only after his resurrection, which is what verse 22 refers to, when they looked back and saw all of this and what he'd said and what he'd done and that he had rose again 3 days later, that they fully understood what all that had been about. And they believed and fully understood it, as if their faith was made complete and came together at that point. That's important to remember as we move on. Verse 23 to 25, Jesus clearly did some miraculous signs at the Passover, which is what the Jews had been demanding. They said, give us a sign, and he talked about the 3-day thing, but he did do some miraculous signs at Passover, and people did believe, it says, in him when he did these miraculous signs. But it also says there Jesus would not entrust himself to them. So why is that if they believed? Well, it seems there was something wrong with their faith. It was based on him doing signs, not genuine, deep, life-changing conviction. It was kind of faith that wouldn't last. It's kind of like when Jesus told the story of the seeds and the scattering of the seeds on the ground. And some fell on the path and some fell on the rocky ground. And so it started to sprout up. It looked like real faith. It looked like they believed, but actually deep down, this was going to wither. There was no depth to it. They'd seen the signs, were amazed. Oh yeah, we believe in you. We'll follow you. But when it got tough, like the weeds, or just because the roots weren't deep enough, it would wither away. And Jesus knew their hearts. Jesus really understood people's faith. He could see through. It's like the old Sunday school thing where it might look okay on the outside, but what's on the inside that matters. And the Greek wordplay here is they believed in him, but Jesus didn't believe in them. He knew that this wasn't genuine faith. We can fool each other sometimes, can't we? But Jesus knows our heart, if our outward faith has depth or not. Now, in drawing this to a close, I want to just highlight again the link between these two stories, but just point out a couple of other things. See, the water into wine story was set in the north in Cana. The cleansing of the temple story was set in the south in Jerusalem. The water into wine story had stone jars, but the cleansing of the temple was a stone temple. In the water into wine story, the purification came through water. And in the cleansing of the temple, the purification was through the sacrifices. In the first story, there was no wine. And in the second story, there was no worship. In the first story, there was some empty vessels. And in the second story, Jesus was emptying the temple. In the first story, Jesus brought new wine. He was doing something new. In the second story, Jesus talks about the new temple. He was the thing that he was doing new through his body and death and resurrection. See, the two stories go so much together, and John had seen this and puts the stories together at this point to share this theological truth with us. That religion in itself is nothing. It's dead. It's faith in Jesus Christ. That is the only way. It's relationship with him. And that faith needs to be genuine, not just not have real root, but needs to be have depth in him. Linking it to today, we remember historically this story is an example of Jesus' struggles and conflict with religious Judaism. But today it challenges us to make sure that we don't fall into the trap of religion over true worship. Are there things in churches like this? Are there things in our lives like this? Do we have genuine worship of God, not just religious ritual? Is going to church or spending this time together just a habit or a hobby? Or is it because we really want to worship God and learn more about him? These are the challenges, some of the challenges that this passage brings to us. And as we turn to communion this morning, and we're going to share communion in just a few moments, as we turn to communion, we need to remember this is not about a religious requirement that has to be done in a certain way, but this is about relational remembrance that can be done any day and in different ways, as long as Jesus is at the center of it. So for some who feel it's hard doing communion this way, remember what the heart of this communion is about. It's about us saying we are one body together because of what Christ has done for us. Because we remember his body broken for us. Because we remember his blood shed for us. Because he died and because he rose again. The new thing that he was doing was providing a way for us to be in right relationship with him because he forgave our sins when he died on the cross.